They laughed when the county's fastest horse collapsed, and they laughed harder when a poor stable boy whispered, "I know how to save him." No one believed until the boy stood against whips, against pride, and against the whole town's scorn. What followed at the county fair shocked everyone, as a broken horse and an invisible child walked together into history. The afternoon light in Bourbon County had a way of turning the pastures into hammered gold. From the ridge, you could see the white rails ribboning across the hills, the barns painted a stubborn, perfect red, and a line of black oaks holding back the sky. It should have been a beautiful day at Harrison Downs. It should have smelled like cut grass and sweet feed and the faint spice of leather polish, the kind of day a winning photograph might be made from. But the air inside the main barn was heavy with antiseptic and worry, and every hoofbeat beyond the doors sounded like a clock running out. Blaze lay in a stall that had held champions for a generation. Broad stalls with brass nameplates and fans that pushed June heat into the rafters. Even on his side, he was a presence. White coat dulled by sweat, a silvered mane dark at the roots, pink skin visible where the hair thinned near the muzzle. He had the kind of head that made you trust him, a classic wedge tapering to thoughtful nostrils, and eyes that, by habit, scanned the world for permission to keep going. Now those eyes were cloudy, as if the world had put a shade over the sun. The veterinarian spoke in a low voice, but voices carry differently in a barn. They run along boards, climb ropes, and slip under doors. "He won't race again," the man said, kneeling to check the swelling, his palm steady, his thumb reading heat like a compass reads north. "We can keep him comfortable. But the tendon is torn through. He was built to run, Mr. Harrison." That's finished. Mr. Harrison stood at the stall gate, immaculate in a linen shirt that didn't seem to know dust. He pressed his jaw once, as if he were biting down on a decision. He was a tall man with Old Kentucky written in the set of his shoulders. Land, history, and an expectation that the world stays in rows. "Do what you can," he said. "We'll discuss options in the morning." Options. The word hummed down the aisle and found the people who lived beneath it. Grooms exchanged glances over wheelbarrow handles. Two exercise riders who had placed bets on Blaze last spring stared at the floorboards as if a number might appear there to reverse what they'd heard. Someone coughed. Someone else muttered something about costs. The great fans above them kept moving and did not change a thing. At the far end of the aisle, near the tack room where a soft glow seeped under the door, a boy froze with a broom half lifted. Ethan didn't belong to the kind of sentence that had options in it. He belonged to the sentences about chores and leftovers, about sleeping on a roll of blankets beside a dented trunk, because there was no other place. 13 years old, and already good at wearing silence, he had learned to pass along walls without touching them. But sometimes a sentence in the air hooked your shirt anyway. "He won't race again." It tugged him forward, slow as a tide moving a boat. He came to the gate and stood just outside the shadow line. Up close, Blaze smelled like fear and mint liniment, like damp wool and rain let in through a crack. His sides rose and fell in an uneven measure. The bandage on his foreleg had loosened and slipped, the tape lifted like a wilted leaf. A fly landed on the exposed edge and wandered without shame. Ethan set the broom aside and slid 2 fingers through the bars. "Hey," he said, and the word didn't carry like the others. It dropped into the stall and stayed there, gentle as a leaf on a pond. Blaze moved his ear toward the sound. It was a small thing, but small things are how bridges begin. The boy waited. He had the patience of someone who had waited for grown-ups his whole life, waited for tempers to cool, for doors to open, for a hand to land kindly instead of hard. The vet lifted his bag and nodded to Harrison. "I'll be back at first light." Footsteps of men leaving, the damp hush of a barn resettling after company. When the aisle was empty, a swallow flickered through the open loft and cut a slender shadow across the hay, quick as a thought. Ethan slid the bolt with care, the way he had seen careful men do it, and stepped inside. He did not try to touch the injury. He set out to touch everything that hurt around it. The fear first. He crouched near Blaze's shoulder, keeping his shape small. "I know your name," he whispered. "They put it on everything. Feed bins, silks, jackets." He smiled with half his mouth. "You looked better on those posters." Blaze turned his head, the effort writing itself in the muscles of his neck. The storm cloud in his eyes thinned a little, the way clouds sometimes show you where the sun is hiding. He took a breath and sent it toward the boy, a warm gust that smelled of hay and hard work. Ethan tilted his head in return, as if they were agreeing to something neither of them had the words for yet. From the doorway, a silhouette paused. One of the senior grooms, a man named Cal with hands like barn doors. "Kid," he said, not unkindly, "you sweep, not meddle." "I'm sweeping," Ethan answered without standing. "Just checking he can breathe around it." Cal's eyes softened. "There's nothing to be done. Mr. Hell, make the call." He didn't say which call. That was a kindness. He adjusted the hanging fan so it didn't blow directly on the bandage. On his way out, he added, "Close up when you're done, here?" Ethan nodded. He listened to the barn empty itself. Boots on gravel, a truck door shutting, the shiver of a trailer hitch. When the quiet settled the way a quilt settles, he let himself reach forward and place his hand low on Blaze's neck, where the skin was warm and not tender. "You hear the doves?" he asked. Outside, two birds traded questions from the fence line. "They always sound like they're apologizing." My grandma used to say that. She said some sounds teach you to be soft. He didn't talk much about his grandmother. Words about her came out like marbles from a cloth bag, too few and too precious. But the barn, with its old wood and tired air and corners that held the past without spilling, felt like a place where a couple of marbles could roll and not be lost. "She could settle the meanest colt with a song," he said. "Didn't have much." Had that Blaze's ear flicked again? The boy began to hum, not the tune he would later try when others listened, but a smaller, older one that sat in his chest like a bird that knew the way home. He hummed until his own breathing matched the horse's better, until the scrape of worry in the air wore down to something that didn't catch on skin. He stopped to wet the corner of a clean rag at the water bucket and wiped the sweat stripes where the halter had rubbed. When he reached the loosened bandage, he did nothing more than press the tape back to keep the edges from catching. He whispered, "I won't pull at it." Promise. He learned very early that promises only count when you say them quietly. At some point, he became aware of a shadow in the aisle. Mr. Harrison, still as a hitching post, watching. The man's face in the dim light looked carved from something that did not bend. "Get out of there," he said. Not loud, not angry, just final. Ethan rose and stepped back, hands in sight. "Yes, sir." He didn't add the dozen things he could have said, that he had only straightened what was crooked, that it helped to have a voice in the room that meant no harm. He picked up the broom and moved toward the door, and at the threshold he turned in spite of himself. "Sir?" he asked. Harrison waited, not encouraging and not dismissing, a man accustomed to hearing only the kind of questions that had prices attached. Ethan swallowed. "If he doesn't run again," he said, "he's still a horse." The sentence hung there, naked and simple. Harrison's eyes narrowed. Not cruel, just tired. He lifted a hand in a gesture that ended conversations. "Don't be late on morning chores." Outside, the land looked untroubled, hills with their long spines and the pond that held the sky without complaining. Fireflies sparked in the grass, a patient constellation. Ethan walked the line of white rails until his steps matched their rhythm. It would be easy to let the night say the last word. It would be easy to convince himself that what he felt in that stall didn't matter, that the grown-ups would grow this problem to its adult size, and he would be too small to do anything about it. But he had seen Blaze's ear turn toward him. He had felt the heat under that coat and the weight of a gaze that, even dulled, searched for kindness like a hand searches for a latch in the dark. He had heard an old tune settle a heaving breath. Little things, yes, but often the hinge on a great door is also small. Back at the tack room, he rolled his blankets out and sat on the trunk. The trunk was dented at one corner. The dent made a shallow cradle for a tin cup he used to keep paper scraps. He drew out a scrap and a pencil no longer than his palm. He wrote one line and folded it and slid it under the corner of the trunk. I saw him listen. He lay down and watched a sliver of barn light pour across the floorboards like a creak and stop just shy of his hand. He thought of the posters with Blaze's name in lettering that made a promise. Speed, victory, a certainty that the future owed you something. He thought of how thin certainty looks when it lies down. He listened to the doves turning their syllables to questions, to the fans lowering themselves, to the old building settling over them all. He did not close his eyes for a long time. Somewhere in the middle hours, he woke from a small noise that did not belong to dreams. He went back to the stall without the broom and without permission. The moon had laid a pale stripe on the center aisle. Blaze lifted his head at the shuffle of the boys' steps and made the low sound horses make when they recognize a pattern that comforts them. Ethan put his hand to the warm part of his neck again. The two of them arranged around pain, as if it were a hot stove sitting between them. "I'll come in the morning," he said, "before the others. We'll try to win a little comfort before the day asks for it all back." He didn't know yet what he could do. He knew only the shape of his attention. He knew the tune his grandmother had left him, and how to press tape flat and how to wait longer than most. He knew the look in another living thing's eyes when it expected to be left and wasn't. He stood there until the fans thudded off and the first birds wrote their tiny words into the dark. When the sun finally climbed the oaks and poured into the barn, the day would bring the lists and the orders and the words that fill up space so that feeling has to stand in the doorway and watch. It would bring decisions that arrived wearing the same boots as every other day. But just before the light reached the brass nameplate, Ethan leaned close enough for the horse to fog his cheek. and whispered the only sentence that felt worth the risk of saying, "I'll be back." And because the morning was kind in that exact moment, Blaze's ear moved, and his breath came a little easier, and the barn, old, tired, faithful, held its breath right along with them. The morning broke with a gray light that flattened the hills, the kind of dawn that felt tired before it began. Ethan woke stiff from the boards beneath his thin blanket in the tack room, rubbing his arms to chase away the chill that crept under the door during the night. He had been at Harrison Downs for almost a year now, long enough to memorize the patterns of chores: sweep the aisles, scrub buckets, carry hay, vanish into the shadows before anyone important had to notice him. 13 years old, with no father to speak of and a mother buried in a cemetery 2 towns over, he was useful in the way a broom was useful. Nobody admired a broom. They only noticed when it wasn't there. He slipped outside, his shoes thin at the soles, and felt the mud pull at them from the recent rain. Beyond the barn, the paddocks stretched, coated with dew. Horses shifted in the half-light, their breath steaming, tails swishing against flies. Ethan paused a moment, watching them, as if the sight might fill him with something steadier than hunger. Then he lifted the rake from its place and began to drag it through the straw, the sound steady as breathing. By mid-morning, the ranch was alive. Stable hands shouted across aisles, grooms carried tack, and somewhere beyond the fences a truck engine groaned. Ethan moved among them unseen. When Cole, the foreman, stormed through, men stepped aside quickly, but no one warned Ethan in time. Cole's shoulder clipped him, sent him sprawling into a water bucket. Dirty water soaked his trousers and dripped from his shirt. Laughter followed. Low, sharp, cruel, not because it was funny, but because it made the boy smaller. Ethan pressed his lips together, climbed to his feet, and went back to sweeping without a word. That was how it always was. He had learned silence was armor. Speak up, and you invited fists, or worse, the long silence of being told to leave. But that day, as the water squelched in his shoes, and his broom traced the same lines it traced every morning, his eyes found the stall at the far end. Blaze lay there, his bandaged leg stretched out awkwardly, the mighty chest rising and falling with effort. The horse looked less like a champion than like a soldier abandoned on a battlefield. Something tugged Ethan toward him. He left the broom propped against the wall and crouched by the half-open door. Inside smelled of iodine and despair. Blaze twitched an ear at the boy's presence, then let his head sink back into the straw. The sight made Ethan's throat tighten. He knew that look. It was the look of someone the world had decided not to need anymore. He remembered nights in his grandmother's trailer when storms shook the tin roof. She would light a lantern and say, "When the world forgets you, child, you don't forget yourself." But what if a creature couldn't speak, couldn't remind anyone of its worth? Who remembered for the horse? Ethan reached out, hesitated, then brushed his fingers along Blaze's jawline where the hair grew soft as smoke. The horse didn't pull away. That was enough. A shadow fell across him. Mary, the cook's daughter, stood with a basket of feed sacks on her hip. She was only a year older than Ethan, but carried herself with the assurance of someone who knew where her next meal was coming from. "You'll catch trouble," she whispered. "I'm only looking," Ethan said. She tilted her head toward the foreman's office. "Cole's in a mood. If he sees you waste time on a broken horse, he'll send you packing." She shouldered past, But before she disappeared, she dropped something small by his foot, a heel of cornbread wrapped in paper. Ethan's chest warmed. Mary had her own way of seeing the invisible. The day stretched long. Horses were exercised, visitors came and went, and Blaze remained unmoving, a ghost in the richest barn in Kentucky. At supper, Ethan sat on an overturned bucket outside the kitchen door, eating the cornbread slowly, letting each bite last. Inside, the staff laughed and clattered dishes, but no one asked him in. He was a shadow, a sound of sweeping, a pair of hands to carry things nobody else wanted to carry. When darkness fell, he crept back to the stall. The lantern light painted the boards orange, and Blaze lifted his head, eyes following the boy's small figure. Ethan squatted down. "They don't see me either," he whispered. "Maybe that's why I see you." The horse exhaled, a rough, weary sound. Ethan pressed his palm against the warm skin of the neck. "You're still here. That has to count for something." For the first time, Blaze pushed his muzzle forward and touched the boy's shoulder. The contact was brief, nothing more than a brush, but it was enough to set a promise burning inside Ethan. No one else believed in the horse. No one believed in him either. But together, maybe they could prove that being invisible didn't mean being useless. The barn was silent when Ethan curled against the straw outside Blaze's stall, the smell of hay sharp in his nose. In the stillness, he whispered a sentence not meant for anyone else. "They'll see us one day." Then he closed his eyes, the horses breathing steady behind him, and for the first night in months, he did not dream of being alone. The morning sun spilled across the paddocks, catching on the dew so that the grass seemed to burn silver. The smell of oats and damp earth filled the barn, mingling with the clatter of buckets and the slap of leather. Ethan had been sweeping since before dawn, moving the broom in quiet strokes, trying to disappear into the rhythm. He thought maybe, if he stayed small enough, no one would notice how he lingered near Blaze's stall. The horse lay still, his injured leg stretched out, but there was a faint brightness in his eyes this morning, a flicker that told Ethan the fight was not finished. Men crowded down the aisle, boots striking sharp against the boards. Mr. Harrison entered first, his linen shirt crisp, his hair slicked back as though he were preparing for a photograph instead of bad news. Behind him came two veterinarians, one young with restless hands, the other older with wire, spectacles that reflected the light. Cole followed, chewing on a piece of straw, his smirk ready for use. A hush spread through the barn, as if the horses themselves knew judgment was about to be given. The elder veterinarian bent to examine Blaze. He pressed along the swollen tendon, muttered something under his breath, then stood and shook his head. "The damage is permanent, Mr. Harrison. He'll never race again. The humane thing would be to put him down." His words were matter-of-fact, delivered like weather, but they struck the boy like thunder. Harrison's jaw tightened. "Do it quietly." "I don't need spectacle." His voice carried the finality of a gavel. The grooms looked away, ashamed but unwilling to oppose him. Cole spat into the dirt, already satisfied with the verdict. The words tore something loose in Ethan. He felt the broom slide from his grip. His heart pounded, his chest burned, and before he could think of consequences, he heard his own voice break through the stillness. "Sir," he said, too loud, trembling, "I know how to save your horse." The barn froze. Every face turned toward the boy, who usually blended into shadows. Cole laughed first, sharp and cruel. "Hear that?" The broom boy's a doctor now." Laughter rippled down the line of men, though some looked uneasy, caught between mockery and disbelief. Harrison's gaze landed on Ethan like a weight. "Who said that?" he asked, though it was plain he already knew. Ethan stepped forward, his knees shaking, his fists clenched to stop them from trembling. "Me, sir," he said. "Ethan. I work the stalls. I can help him." The laughter swelled, but Harrison lifted a hand, and silence returned. He studied the boy for a long moment, eyes narrowing as though considering a puzzle. "You claim to know more than 2 licensed veterinarians?" he asked, voice even, but dangerous. Ethan swallowed. "No, sir. I don't know more. But I know something different. My grandmother, she used to heal horses when the doctors gave up. She taught me how to care for wounds, how to calm them. I can't make him race again, but I can help him live without pain." His voice cracked on the last word, but the fire in it was unmistakable. The veterinarians shifted uncomfortably. Cole burst out laughing again, covering his mouth to hide the disrespect from his employer. "You hear this? The kid wants to play miracle worker. Blaze'll be meat before the week's out." Harrison said nothing for a long time. Then his lips curved in a smile that had no warmth. "Very well. If you're so certain, let's make it interesting. 7 days. If Blaze stands and walks without faltering by then, you may stay here. Ask for a reward, even. But if you fail," his smile hardened, "you'll be gone from my land by nightfall." A low murmur ran through the barn. The challenge was cruel, stacked against the boy, but no one dared speak against the master. Ethan felt the ground sway under him. The smart thing would be to bow his head, apologize, step back into the shadows. But Blaze shifted, a low sound rumbling from his throat, and the boy knew retreat was no longer an option. "I accept," Ethan said. His voice was steadier now, anchored by something larger than himself. "I'll save him." Cole barked a laugh. "Mark my words, the brat won't last a day." The men shook their heads, some sneering, some pitying. Mary appeared at the edge of the group, her face pale with worry, clutching a basket as if she could hide behind it. Sam, the old farrier, watched with his arms crossed, saying nothing but his eyes sharp and thoughtful. Harrison nodded once, dismissive. 7 days. Show me your miracle." He turned on his heel and strode out, his entourage following. When the barn quieted, Ethan was left standing in the center of the aisle, sweat prickling his back, the taste of fear sharp on his tongue. Blaze lay watching him, ears tipped forward, as if the horse had understood every word. The boy stepped closer to the stall, pressed his hand against the bars. "I don't know how yet," he whispered, "but I'll find a way. We're not done, you and me." The horse blew a tired breath against the straw. Somewhere above, a dove cooed, and the sound settled into the silence like a promise. Ethan straightened, picked up the broom he had dropped, and returned to his chores with his heart pounding, his life forever altered by the sentence he had spoken aloud. He had claimed the impossible, and now the whole farm was waiting to see him fail. But for the first time in his short life, Ethan felt the spark of something greater than fear, the beginning of defiance. Night fell heavy over Harrison Downs, the air thick with the scent of hay and distant thunder. Ethan sat alone in the tack room, knees pulled to his chest, the day's events echoing through his head. The laughter of the men still rang in his ears, but louder than that was the voice of Mr. "Harrison, 7 days. Show me your miracle." Each word carried the weight of doom. He had spoken boldly, too boldly, and now there was no turning back. Yet in the hollow of fear, something else glimmered. Determination, fragile but alive. The tack room was cluttered with cast-off tools, cracked leather, and a trunk that had belonged to his grandmother. He had dragged it here months ago, more out of sentiment than purpose. Now, as he pulled the trunk into the lantern light, it felt like the last door he could open. The hinges groaned when he lifted the lid. Inside lay worn quilts, a chipped mug, and at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a small, leather-bound notebook. His grandmother had carried it everywhere, scribbling notes in her looping hand. She had been a healer of sorts, working in the Tennessee hills where money was scarce but love for animals abundant. Farmers brought her their injured mules, their colts with fevers, their dogs torn in hunts. She treated them with what she had, herbs gathered from creek beds, poultices made in stone mortars, whispered songs to quiet panic. Ethan remembered nights by the fire, her voice low. A wound isn't just flesh, boy. Fear makes it worse. Calm the spirit first, then mend the body. He opened the notebook carefully. The pages smelled of earth and smoke, each one crowded with recipes: comfrey for swelling, arnica for bruises, honey for infection. But among the notes were also sayings underlined in red ink. Respect heals faster than force. Another read, if the animal trusts you, half the battle is already won. Ethan traced the words with his finger. They felt alive, as though his grandmother were whispering them straight into the room. He stayed awake deep into the night, copying passages onto scraps of paper he could carry in his pocket. His hands trembled, not from exhaustion, but from hope. The first plan forming in the fog. He would gather herbs, make poultices, clean the wound with care instead of haste. He would sing the songs she had taught him, even if the men mocked. Maybe they could laugh all they wanted. The horse wouldn't. Blaze would know the difference. The following morning dawned bright and sharp, and Ethan set about his chores with a new urgency. He stole time where he could. 5 minutes after mucking stalls, 10 minutes before supper, to slip into the woods edging the property. There, among the ferns and limestone, he searched for plants he remembered from his grandmother's lessons. Wild comfrey, its broad leaves damp with dew. Yarrow, white heads trembling in the breeze. He stuffed them into a burlap sack, dirt clinging to his fingernails. Each plant was a piece of memory, each stem a rope tying him back to her strength. Mary caught him once, crouched near the fence line with his hands full of leaves. "What are you doing?" she asked, her eyes darting to make sure no one else saw. Ethan hesitated, then opened his palm. "Medicine. For Blaze." She frowned. "You'll get in trouble." "I'll get in worse trouble if I fail," he said simply. Something softened in her face. She slipped a small jar of honey into his sack. "Mama keeps it for sore throats. Maybe it'll help." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Then she hurried off, leaving Ethan with a warmth in his chest that matched the sunlight spilling through the trees. That evening, when the barn had quieted and the last of the grooms had gone, Ethan slipped into Blaze's stall. The horse lay as before, his eyes dulled, but he lifted his head when the boy entered. Ethan spoke softly, his voice steady, though his hands shook. "Easy, boy. We'll try something tonight." He mixed the herbs with warm water in a tin bowl, crushing them until the air filled with the bitter, clean scent of plants. He dipped a rag, wrung it out, and gently pressed it to the swollen leg. Blaze flinched, but Ethan crooned a tune, low and steady, the same melody his grandmother used when storms rattled the roof. Slowly, the horse stilled. His breathing eased, his muscles slackened under the boy's touch. Ethan's throat tightened with emotion. It wasn't a miracle, not yet, but it was something, the beginning of a bridge between despair and hope. Hours later, exhausted, Ethan leaned against the stall wall. The notebook lay open on his lap, lantern light flickering across the ink. He whispered aloud, a line underlined in his grandmother's hand. When no one believes, that's when belief matters most. Blaze shifted in the straw, his eye reflecting the faint glow, and Ethan felt the truth of it settle deep in his bones. He knew the road ahead would be merciless. 7 days was not enough for healing. The men would mock, Harrison would wait for him to fail, and Cole would do worse than laugh. But in that stall, with the smell of herbs in the air and the slow, even sound of Blaze's breathing, Ethan allowed himself to believe. He clutched the notebook to his chest like a talisman and closed his eyes, whispering a promise to the dark. I won't let them end you. Not while I'm here. The barn settled around them, ancient wood creaking as though it had heard vows before and knew how heavy they were. Ethan drifted to sleep against the stall, the notebook slipping from his hands. Outside, the wind stirred through the pasture grass, carrying the faintest hint of rain, and somewhere in the deep heart of the horse, a spark flickered. Small, fragile, but alive. The days at Harrison Downs moved with the weight of routine, the same sounds and smells folding over themselves until they blurred. Yet for Ethan, each moment felt sharpened, alive with urgency. Every sweep of the broom, every bucket carried, was part of the countdown that ticked louder in his chest. 6 days now. 6 days to make good on words he had spoken without thinking. Words that had set the whole ranch watching him with smirks and suspicion. He kept the notebook hidden under his shirt, its weight pressing against him like a heartbeat. That evening, when the men shuffled to supper and the barn grew still, Ethan lit a lantern low and knelt by Blaze's side. The horse twitched at the smell of herbs, but Ethan murmured to him, voice soft as a lullaby. He mixed yarrow and honey into a paste, spreading it gently across the angry swelling. Blaze shivered, but instead of pulling away, he let out a sigh that rattled through the straw. Ethan brushed his fingers through the horse's mane, whispering, We'll get through this, you and me. A creak at the door startled him. He turned, clutching the jar to his chest, expecting Cole's sneer, or worse. But it was only Mary, standing in the doorway with her braid falling loose and her eyes glinting in the lantern light. She stepped inside quickly, closing the door behind her. In her hands was a folded cloth. Mama said nothing, she whispered. But I took some beeswax from the kitchen. Helps keep a wound clean. She handed it over with a nervous glance toward the darkened aisle. Ethan's throat tightened. Why are you helping me? Mary shrugged, but her voice was steady. Because everyone deserves someone to believe in them. Even a horse. Even you. Her words settled like balm over his raw fear. For the first time in days, Ethan smiled without forcing it. Later that night, as he ground herbs in a dented mortar, another figure approached. Sam, the old farrier, moved with the heaviness of age, but also with a quiet grace. His beard was streaked with gray, his hands knotted from decades of shaping iron. He leaned against the stall gate, watching the boy work. "You know, lad," he said slowly, "I've seen plenty try to mend a horse with rope and rage. None of them lasted. But what you're doing, it reminds me of the old ways." Ethan paused, wary. "Are you going to tell Mr. Harrison?" Sam shook his head. "Not if it means saving a creature that still has fight in him. Your grandma taught you well, I'd wager." His eyes softened at the notebook half hidden under Ethan's knee. "You keep at it. But mind this, don't expect the others to clap for you. They'll wait for you to fail. That's what men do when they're scared of being shown wrong." He rested a heavy hand on Ethan's shoulder, then shuffled off into the night. The barn felt different after that. The shadows no longer pressed so hard against Ethan. Instead, they seemed to lean closer, holding secrets safe. With Mary slipping him stolen supplies and Sam offering quiet counsel, he felt less alone. Blaze, too, seemed to sense the change. His eyes followed Ethan more often, ears flicking toward his voice. The horse still struggled to rise, his muscles trembling under the weight of injury. But when Ethan hummed a tune, Blaze stilled, as though listening. By the fourth night, Ethan's hands were raw from pounding roots, his back aching from chores piled higher than ever. Cole seemed to delight in giving him the heaviest loads, muttering about charlatans under his breath. Yet each time Ethan staggered back to the barn with his herbs and cloths, he found strength waiting in Blaze's gaze. The boy knelt, cleaned the wounds, spread the poultices, whispered stories of his grandmother's farm in Tennessee. And the horse, broken yet proud, accepted it all. One night, as the lantern sputtered low, Ethan leaned against Blaze's flank and whispered, "I'm not strong like them. I don't have money or power, but I can stay. I can wait. I can care." "Maybe that's enough." Blaze turned his head, pressing his muzzle briefly against the boy's shoulder. It was a small gesture, but in it was something vast, a recognition, a bond forged in silence. In those moments, Ethan realized he was not entirely invisible anymore. Mary saw him. Sam believed in him. And Blaze, though voiceless, had begun to answer him in ways deeper than words. Allies were forming in the quiet places, unseen by the men who laughed and wagered against him. The boy clutched the notebook close and let the hope fill him. The countdown was still ticking, but for the first time, he did not fear the sound. It was the drumbeat of a fight worth waging. The morning began with the clang of buckets and the sharp crack of a whip striking against a post. Ethan stiffened at the sound before he even reached the barn. He had grown used to the rhythm of Harrison Downs, the rustle of hay, the squeak of leather straps, the low nickers of horses greeting one another. But the whip carried a different kind of note, one that made the air taste like iron. When he rounded the corner of the main stable, he saw Cole standing in the aisle, his arms swinging with practiced ease. Blaze flinched inside his stall, pressing himself into the straw. "Get up, you useless beast," Cole barked. His boots thudded as he stepped closer, whip coiled in one hand. "The master's wasting feed on you. Let's see if pain can buy what kindness can't." Ethan's chest tightened. He moved before he could think, slipping between Cole and the stall door. "Stop," he said, his voice raw. Cole sneered, towering over him. "Out of the way, rat. You think your grandma's leaf soup is going to fix this horse? He needs discipline." "He needs care," Ethan answered, the words shaking but firm. "Respect heals what force destroys." The barn fell into silence. A few workers paused in their chores, leaning on pitchforks, watching with uneasy amusement. Nobody challenged Cole. He was the foreman, second only to Harrison, and his temper was legend. Cole's laugh rolled out, deep and cruel. Respect? From a boy who sleeps in a tack room? Don't tell me how to treat an animal. You'll be gone in 5 days anyway. He shoved Ethan back, the boy stumbling against the stall door, but Ethan held his ground, planting himself in front of Blaze. Blaze shifted, his ears flicking, nostrils flaring. For a moment, the horse's gaze moved from Cole's whip to Ethan's small figure, and a strange calm seemed to ripple through the stall. Ethan lifted a hand, palm out, as if shielding Blaze from more than just the whip. "You want to mock me? Fine," Ethan said, his voice rising despite the pounding in his chest. "But you don't touch him." The workers chuckled, though uneasily. Some shook their heads, muttering about foolishness, but others watched more closely, as though something in the boy's defiance unsettled them. Cole's face darkened. He raised the whip, not to strike Blaze this time, but to make the boy flinch. Ethan didn't move. It was Sam's voice that broke the tension. "That's enough, Cole." The old farrier stood in the shadows, his hands on his hips, his eyes steady. "The master wants the horse alive for now. Don't risk Harrison's anger on a whim," Cole spat on the ground, lowering the whip reluctantly. "Fine. Let the brat play healer. When he fails, he'll be off this land, and I'll be here to watch." He shoved past, muttering curses as he stalked down the aisle. The sound of his boots faded, but the echo of his cruelty lingered. Ethan slumped against the stall door, his breath ragged. Sam stepped closer, laying a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You've got spirit, boy," he said. "But spirit without grit burns out fast. You'll need more than defiance to keep going." Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll find it," he whispered. "For him." That evening, when the barn had emptied and the cicadas droned outside, Ethan returned to Blaze. He set down his bundle of herbs, his hands trembling from more than exhaustion. He cleaned the wound carefully, brushing away the old bandages Cole had left caked with dirt. Blaze quivered at first, but Ethan kept his voice steady, humming the same tune his grandmother once sang over skittish foals. The horse's muscles eased under his touch, the swell of panic replaced with a slow rhythm of trust. The boy's own body ached, his back sore from chores doubled by Cole's spite. His palms were blistered from hauling feed bags heavier than himself. Yet every time Blaze leaned his head closer, every time the horse stilled beneath his care, Ethan felt a current of strength he didn't know he had. In the distance, laughter rose from the bunkhouse where the workers gathered. He could hear their voices carrying through the night air, bets placed on how soon the boy would fail. Jokes about broom boys playing doctor. Each laugh stung, each word twisted like a knife. But instead of crumbling, the cruelty hardened into resolve. He whispered to Blaze, "They'll see. Not because I want to prove them wrong, but because you deserve better than this." Blaze shifted, letting his muzzle rest briefly against Ethan's arm. The warmth of the gesture spread through the boy like fire on a cold night. For the first time since the challenge began, Ethan believed not only in possibility, but in destiny. That his voice, his hands, his heart had been brought here for a reason. The barn creaked around them, old wood settling as though listening. Outside, the night deepened, stars scattering across the Kentucky sky. Ethan leaned against the stall, exhausted but unbroken, and made his silent vow. No amount of humiliation would drive him away. His fight had only just begun. The Kentucky summer stretched long into the evenings, the air thick with the smell of cut hay and honeysuckle. The days had begun to blur together, but for Ethan each one carved itself into memory. The humiliation still clung to him like mud that wouldn't wash off, yet beneath it something stubborn had begun to burn. Every night, after the ranch hands drifted into sleep and the lanterns in the big house dimmed, he slipped back into the barn with his notebook tucked under his arm and his pockets filled with leaves and scraps of cloth. Blaze was always waiting. On the third night after his defiance, Ethan found the horse lying more still than usual, his head sunk into the straw, his breath shallow. Panic rose in the boy's chest, sharp and suffocating. He dropped to his knees and pressed a hand against the horse's neck. The warmth was still there, faint, but steady. "I'm here," he whispered, voice trembling. "I didn't leave you." The words poured out like a promise, binding him to the animal, as if their fates had already fused. He worked quietly, unwrapping the filthy bandages Cole had left to fester. The wound was ugly, swollen and hot, the skin puckered around the edges. Ethan cleaned it with a mixture of honey and herbs he had ground into a paste, the smell sharp and earthy. Blaze winced, his muscles twitching, but he didn't lash out. Instead, his eyes fixed on the boy, as if testing whether the hands on him meant harm or help. Ethan hummed under his breath, an old lullaby his grandmother had crooned during storms. The tune was crooked and low, but the effect was undeniable. Blaze's breathing slowed, his trembling stilled, and in the hush of the barn, the boy's cracked voice wove itself into hope. The next morning, Ethan's bones ached from sleeping on the straw, but he rose before dawn to muck stalls and haul hay, as if nothing had changed. He hid his fatigue behind silence, carrying buckets while the men jeered. "The broom doctor still playing nursemaid?" one muttered. Cole sneered openly, loading Ethan with twice the work, hoping to break him before the deadline. Ethan said nothing. Words weren't armor here. What mattered was that when the sun dipped again, he would return to Blaze. By the fifth night, a change had begun. Small, but real. Blaze lifted his head at the sound of Ethan's footsteps, ears flicking forward as though recognizing him. When Ethan crouched and pressed his forehead lightly to the horse's, a low rumble answered. Not pain this time, but something gentler, almost curious. Tears pricked Ethan's eyes. "That's it, boy," he whispered. "You know me now. You know I won't hurt you." Mary slipped in that evening, carrying a jar of warm water she claimed was left over from the kitchen. She set it down without a word, only meeting Ethan's gaze for a moment before hurrying back. It was enough. Later, Sam passed by, leaning on the stall gate, his silhouette heavy in the lantern glow. He didn't speak either, just nodded once, slow and approving, before shuffling away. Their quiet gestures stitched into Ethan's resolve, invisible threads holding him steady when doubt threatened to unravel him. The days blurred into work, and nights into healing. Ethan sang when he cleaned the wounds, his voice cracking but steady. He told Blaze stories about the hills of Tennessee, about his grandmother's cabin that smelled of pine smoke and biscuits, about nights when the world seemed to forget them, but they held on anyway. Blaze listened. He shifted less when Ethan touched him, even leaning into the boy's hand at times. For a creature once praised only for speed, the gift of stillness became its own kind of miracle. On the seventh night, thunder rolled low across the horizon, rattling the barn doors. The horses stamped nervously, their whinnies sharp against the storm. Blaze stirred, his eyes flashing white. Ethan climbed into the stall, pressing close, his small frame trembling as much from fear as determination. He wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, humming louder now, louder than the thunder. "It's just noise," he whispered, voice nearly drowned. "You're safe. I'm here." Slowly, Blaze's panic ebbed. His breathing steadied, his great head lowering until it rested against Ethan's shoulder. The boy held him like a brother, his own tears wetting the horse's mane. In that fragile moment, a truth bloomed between them. Survival was no longer the goal. They were fighting for more than life. They were fighting for dignity, for the right to be seen, for the hope that even the broken could rise again. When the storm passed and the barn settled into silence, Ethan remained there, cheek pressed against Blaze's neck, the faint thud of the horse's heartbeat steady against his ear. He closed his eyes, exhaustion heavy, but his lips curled into the smallest of smiles. For the first time since Harrison's cruel bargain, he no longer felt like a boy counting down to failure. He felt like someone who had already begun to win. The day of the Bourbon County Fair dawned hot and loud, the air buzzing with cicadas and the distant clang of machinery being set up on the fairgrounds. The scent of fried dough and roasted corn drifted across the open fields, mingling with the sharper tang of horse sweat and leather. Trucks rattled down the gravel road toward the gates, hauling trailers and laughing families. For most in the county, the fair was a place of celebration, wagers, and pride. For Ethan, it was a march toward judgment. Mr. Harrison walked ahead of the group like a general leading his men, his crisp linen jacket spotless despite the dust swirling up from the road. He had ordered Blaze loaded into a battered trailer at dawn, brushing off Ethan's protests. "No use hiding him in the barn," he'd said. "Let the people see what's become of my champion. Maybe I'll even earn back $1 or $2. His tone was light, but his eyes gleamed with something crueler, the desire to humiliate the boy who had dared challenge him. Ethan rode in the back of the wagon with Mary and Sam, though neither spoke. Mary's hands were folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale. Sam chewed on a piece of straw, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Ethan's heart pounded against his ribs, his palms sweating as the trailer clattered over each rut in the road. From inside, Blaze shifted uneasily, and Ethan leaned close to the slats, whispering, "Easy, boy, we'll get through." When they reached the fairgrounds, chaos swallowed them whole. Bright banners flapped above the arena, children darted between stalls, and men in wide-brimmed hats shouted bets over the din. The smell of dust hung heavy in the air, stirred by the hooves of dozens of restless horses. Blaze was led out of the trailer, his white coat dulled with grime, his leg still bandaged but cleaner than it had been in weeks. Laughter rippled through the crowd as whispers spread. "That's Harrison's prize? Looks more like glue than glory. Thought he'd fetch a fortune. That horse can barely stand." The words struck Ethan like stones, but worse was the look on Mr. Harrison's face, smug, satisfied, as if each jeer was another coin in his pocket. He led Blaze to the center of the fairgrounds and tied him to a post as though displaying a curiosity. The horse stood with head lowered, flanks shivering under the weight of so many eyes. Ethan felt the sting of humiliation, but he couldn't stay silent. He pushed through the ring of men until he stood beside the horse, placing his hand firmly on Blaze's neck. His voice cracked, but carried. "This horse is not for sale." He's healing, and I'll prove it. The fairground seemed to freeze. Conversations halted, the barkers fell quiet, and even the children stilled. A murmur rose, disbelief and curiosity mingling. Mr. Harrison turned slowly, his expression sharpening from surprise to fury. "What did you say, boy?" Ethan swallowed hard, though his knees shook. "He's not broken. He just needs time. I'll show you." Laughter exploded around him, cruel and booming. Cole's voice cut through it. "The broom rat thinks he's a miracle worker." The foreman's grin was wide, his eyes glittering with malice. Harrison raised a hand, silencing the crowd. His smile returned, but it was the smile of a predator. "Very well," he said, his voice carrying across the arena. "If you're so sure, here's your chance. Walk him, one full circle around this ring. If he makes it, perhaps I'll consider sparing him. If he fails," his eyes lingered on Ethan with deliberate cruelty, "then you leave my ranch tonight." For good gasps and whispers rippled through the spectators. Bets sprang up immediately, men shouting odds, money changing hands. Most wagered against the boy. A few shook their heads, pity in their eyes, but none offered help. Ethan stood frozen, the weight of every gaze pressing on his back. Mary tried to step forward, but Sam held her arm. "He has to do this himself," the old man murmured. Ethan turned to Blaze. The horse's ears flicked nervously, nostrils flaring as the crowd leaned closer. Fear rolled off him like heat from the sun. Ethan laid his forehead against Blaze's, shutting out the noise, whispering so only the horse could hear. "It's just you and me, boy!" "Forget them. One step at a time." The air inside the fairground seemed to tighten, as though holding its breath. Ethan untied the rope with shaking fingers, looped it loosely in his hand, and gave the softest tug. At first, Blaze didn't move, his body locked with tension. Jeers rose from the crowd, but then, with a slow exhale, the horse shifted his weight, lifted his good leg, and took a halting step. The laughter faltered. A hush spread, broken only by the shuffle of hooves on dirt. Ethan walked beside him, murmuring encouragement, never pulling, only guiding. Blaze limped, but he moved forward, ears tuned to the boy's voice instead of the crowd. Each step felt like a miracle painted in dust. From the corner of his eye, Ethan caught Cole moving along the rail, whip hidden at his side. A chill ran through him. The foreman's intent was clear, but Ethan pressed closer to Blaze, shielding him with his small frame. "Ignore them," he whispered fiercely. "We'll finish this together." The crowd leaned forward, torn between anticipation and disbelief, as the boy and the broken champion began their slow, perilous circle. The fairground, once filled with laughter and derision, now trembled with something else. The shadow of a miracle, waiting to unfold. The circle of onlookers tightened around the fairground ring, dust rising in a low haze as boots shuffled and wagers passed from hand to hand. The smell of beer, tobacco, and fried food mixed with the pungent sweat of horses tied to nearby rails. Above it all, the sun beat down mercilessly, painting every shadow black and every failure brighter. Ethan felt the weight of the entire county pressing on his small frame, their voices swelling in a tide that threatened to drown him. Blaze stood beside him, trembling but alert, ears pinned back at the noise. Mr. Harrison stepped into the ring, his white jacket crisp, as though dirt had never dared touch him. He raised a hand, silencing the murmurs until the air itself seemed to strain to hear his words. "You've all seen the boy's claim," he announced, his voice smooth and cold. "He says he can save my horse. Very well, let's give him a chance to prove it. One lap around this ring. If Blaze completes it, the boy may stay. If he fails—" Harrison paused, letting the silence grow heavy. "He leaves my ranch before nightfall, with nothing." A roar followed, half laughter, half excitement. Bets multiplied, coins clinking, scraps of paper exchanged with quick hands. No one bet on Ethan, not one. The odds were cruel, the outcome certain in their eyes. Even the children pressed against the rails laughed, pointing at the small, barefoot boy and the limping horse beside him. Mary stood just beyond the crowd, her face pale, lips pressed tight to keep from crying out. Sam rested a hand on her shoulder, shaking his head slowly. "Let him try, girl. This is his fight now." His weathered eyes, though stern, held a flicker of pride. Cole slouched against the fence, chewing on his straw, his grin wide and predatory. His whip was coiled loosely in his hand, hidden from most eyes, but Ethan saw it and felt his stomach twist. The foreman's gaze locked on him like a hawk circling prey. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry as dust. He turned to Blaze, running his palm along the horse's neck. The coat, though still dull from weeks of pain, felt warm and alive under his touch. He leaned close, pressing his forehead gently against Blaze's. "They think we'll fail," he whispered, his voice shaking but fierce. "Maybe we will. But we'll do it together. One step at a time." The crowd jeered for the show to begin. Harrison lifted his arm again. "Start." Ethan tugged lightly at the rope. Blaze shifted, his injured leg trembling. For a moment he refused to move, fear anchoring him to the dirt. Laughter rippled through the ring. "He won't take a step," someone shouted. "Pay up already." Ethan's heart thudded painfully, but he didn't yank the rope. Instead, he began to hum, the low, uneven tune his grandmother had taught him, a sound that seemed out of place in the roaring fairground. Blaze flicked his ear toward the sound, then took a shaky step forward. The laughter faltered, replaced by murmurs of surprise. Ethan walked beside him, whispering encouragement with every step. "That's it, boy. Easy. Just follow me." Dust clung to his bare feet, the sun scorching his back. But he didn't look at the crowd. He kept his gaze fixed on Blaze, as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. Halfway around the ring, sweat streaked Ethan's face. Blaze limped heavily, his muscles trembling with each stride. The crowd began to shout again, voices sharp. "He'll collapse!" Just a matter of time. Coins clinked in Cole's hands as he took more bets. Then, when Blaze stumbled and nearly fell, the roar of laughter was deafening. Ethan darted to his side, steadying him with both arms. "It's okay," he whispered. "Just rest. We'll keep going when you're ready." The pause stretched, the crowd growing restless, mocking. "The broom boy's lullaby won't fix a broken leg." Cole's voice cut above the rest, sharp and mocking. But Blaze, leaning against the boy's steady presence, blew out a long breath and pushed forward once more. Ethan's chest swelled with relief, but the danger wasn't over. As they neared the final stretch, Cole shifted along the rail, whip dangling at his side. His eyes narrowed, waiting for the moment when hope was highest, when the crowd leaned forward with belief. His arm twitched. Ethan saw it. His heart hammered. He stepped closer to Blaze, placing himself between the whip and the horse. His small body was no shield, but his voice rose above the din, raw and desperate. "No one will ever hurt him again. Not while I'm here." The words cracked through the fairground, louder than the jeers, louder even than the whip's hiss, as Cole lowered it reluctantly under Harrison's watchful eye. For a heartbeat, silence hung. Then Blaze took another step, then another, until the line of the ring loomed just ahead. The fairground buzzed with disbelief, the cruel bet suddenly no longer certain. Ethan's chest heaved, his face streaked with sweat and dust, but his eyes burned with something unshakable. Whether they finished or not, the boy had already changed the terms of the wager. This was no longer just about a horse walking a circle. It was about dignity, defiance, and the bond that no jeer or whip could sever. The ring was silent, in a way no fairground had ever been silent. The rides creaked in the distance, the scent of roasting corn still hung in the air, but all of it felt muted under the weight of what was unfolding inside the dirt circle. Ethan kept one hand light on the rope, and the other brushing Blaze's neck, his voice low, almost swallowed by the heat. "It's just us, boy." One more step. Blaze's body trembled, sweat darkening the hair along his flanks. The bandaged leg shook with each attempt to bear weight, but he did not stop. Every step seemed like defiance etched into the dirt, and though the crowd had come to laugh, their jeers had died into breathless murmurs. The boy who was supposed to fail was walking a broken horse through a miracle. Halfway around, Blaze faltered. His hoof caught on the packed earth, sending him to his knees. A gasp rose from the spectators, followed by cruel laughter from Cole. "There it is! The broom rat's fantasy is over." But Ethan dropped to his knees beside the horse, wrapping his arms around Blaze's neck. His own body trembled, his shirt sticking to his back with sweat, but his voice cut steady through the noise. "You don't owe them anything. You don't have to prove yourself to them. Just to us. Just one more breath. One more step." The horse's sides heaved, nostrils flaring. For a moment, Ethan thought it was over, that Harrison would call for Blaze's end right there in the dust. But then Blaze lifted his head, ears flicking toward the boy's voice, and pushed himself upright. His legs shook, dirt clinging to his knees, but he stood. The fairground held its breath. Ethan rose too, brushing dust from his knees, and began to hum that crooked tune his grandmother had sung long ago. The sound was soft, so soft it shouldn't have been heard over the crowd, yet somehow it carried. Blaze's ears twitched again, and together they took another step. The ring seemed to shrink, every eye locked on the fragile pair. Children leaned forward against the rails, their earlier laughter gone. Men who had bet against them shifted uneasily, bills clutched in their fists. Even Harrison, leaning elegantly against the fence, frowned slightly, as if the outcome no longer felt entirely certain. Cole's jaw clenched, his whip twitching in his hand, but under the weight of so many witnesses, he dared not move. The walk dragged on, each stride an eternity. Ethan whispered with every breath, "Easy, steady. You're not alone." Dust rose in little clouds around their feet, catching the light of the late afternoon sun. Sweat stung Ethan's eyes, but he blinked it away, refusing to look anywhere but at the horse beside him. He felt the world narrowing, not to the laughter or the odds, but to the steady miracle of motion. Hoof, breath, hum, step. When they reached the final quarter of the ring, the crowd erupted in a low rumble. "He's close." Too close. Bets shifted hands again, voices rising with disbelief. Harrison's eyes darkened, but he said nothing. He only crossed his arms tighter, lips pressed thin. Blaze stumbled once more, his head dropping, but Ethan pressed his forehead against the horses and whispered fiercely, "No one can take this from us." Not today. His arms shook as he steadied Blaze, but the horse lifted his head again, eyes locking with the boy's. Something passed between them, an understanding born not of commands or fear, but of trust. Blaze stepped forward, and this time his stride was surer. The final stretch stretched like a lifetime. Ethan's heart hammered, every muscle aching, but the rope in his hand felt like a lifeline, tethering him to a creature that refused to quit. The last few feet disappeared under their determination, and then, before anyone could stop it, Blaze crossed the line where they had begun. Silence. For a heartbeat. No one moved. No one breathed. Then a murmur rippled through the crowd, swelling into shouts, disbelief, applause, and even cheers. Some men cursed as they handed over wagers. Others clapped hands to their mouths in astonishment. Children squealed, pointing at the horse that had done the impossible. Ethan stood in the dust, chest heaving, his shirt soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead. Blaze stood beside him, sides quivering, but his head was high, eyes brighter than they had been in weeks. The boy leaned into the horse, pressing his face to the warm, damp neck. "We did it," he whispered, so quietly that only Blaze could hear. On the far side of the ring, Harrison's smile was thin and venomous. He raised his hand for silence, and slowly the noise died. His voice cut cold and sharp. "A lap at a crawl doesn't make a champion. Do not mistake pity for proof." The words stung, yet even he could not erase what the crowd had just witnessed. Ethan met his gaze across the ring, his own expression steady, no longer a shadow, but something unshakable. The crowd might forget by morning. Bets might fade into memory. But the image of a boy and a broken horse walking the silent ring together would linger. In that moment, under the fading Kentucky sun, Ethan knew he had not just walked Blaze around a circle. He had carried them both into something larger than ridicule, larger even than survival. Hope made flesh, moving step by fragile step through the dust. For a breathless beat after the finish, the fairground forgot how to be loud. The Ferris wheel rattled. Somewhere beyond the pens, a generator throbbed like a distant drum. But inside the ring, all that existed was a boy with dust on his knees and a white horse standing tall enough to touch the light. Then noise crashed back in. Cheers, curses, the slap of palms against the rails. Money changed hands with sour looks and reluctant grins. Children pointed, their faces bright with the wonder that arrives when the impossible decides to behave like something ordinary. Ethan pressed his forehead to Blaze's warm neck, letting the horse's breath fog his cheek. Sweat threaded down his back, and the rope burned his palm where hope had held on too tightly. He pulled away just enough to see Blaze's eyes. Clearer. Searching. Steadied by the fact that they had gone the length together, and the world had not ended. The boy's chest hitched. He swallowed hard to keep it from showing. Harrison stepped from the rail with the measured grace of a man who never hurried. Dust refused him as if by instruction. "A quaint display," he said, voice cool as a pane of glass. "But a crawl around a circle changes nothing. We are not in the habit of awarding victory for sympathy." He let the words hang where they could cast a shadow. Booze scattered the ring like thrown gravel. Not many, but enough to lift the hair on Ethan's arms. A woman near the corner called out, "He walked, didn't he?" A man with a rolled program tapped it against his thigh. "Let the boy keep his job, H." Another, angling for favor, laughed too loudly. "Give him a ribbon for housekeeping." The crowd teetered on the edge, between hard habit and something newer that made them uneasy, respect for a child they had come to mock. Cole slipped along the fence line, restless as a fly that couldn't find the one open window. The coil of leather dangled from his hand like a thought he hadn't let go. His eyes, small and mean, flicked from the horse to the boy, then to the faces in the stands, measuring the weather. He didn't like storms he hadn't ordered. "Back him out," Harrison said with a dismissive tilt of his chin. "There's been enough theater." He turned as if the matter were settled. Ethan didn't move. "You said if he made the lap, I could stay." The sentence was steady, but it quivered at the edges, a reed held against a current. Harrison faced him again. The smile that touched his mouth didn't reach his eyes. "I said perhaps." He spread his hands, the ringmaster gracious in his refusal. "We do not rebuild our business on perhaps." A low grumble rose. Sam, planted like an old fence post by the gate, removed the straw from his mouth. "A man's word is a nail, or it's mud," he said. Not loud, but it carried. Cole saw his moment in the wobble. He slung the coil once, twice. Not striking. Testing. The movement drew attention the way lightning sketches the sky before it speaks. Blaze's ears went flat. The horse shied sideways, his injured leg, threatening to fold beneath him. Ethan turned so fast he nearly tangled in the rope. He stepped between leather and horse without thinking. One hand up, the other open as if to catch a blow that should never have been there. "No," he said, and the sound was bigger than his body. Heat charged up his spine, a clean, bright anger that made his voice ring. "No one will ever hurt him again." "Not while I'm here?" The declaration cracked like a shot in dry air. Conversation stalled. Even the ride music seemed to falter. Notes hanging, listening. A boy with dust on his face had said something the adults had forgotten how to say without flinching. Cole's lip curled. "Out of the way, rat." He drew his arm back. Not much, just enough. The space between movement and act stretched thin. Mary was already moving before she knew it, skirting the rail, eyes wide as alarm bells. "Ethan!" Sam's hand on her shoulder held her like a knot. An official in a blue armband, late to the drama, shouldered in with the blunt authority of a man used to separating trouble from spectacle. "Easy there," he warned, palm out toward Cole. "No hitting in the ring." His gaze slid to Harrison. "You want this in the papers, sir?" Because it's headed there, Harrison's nostrils pinched. In that narrow flare, the crowd learned something essential about their host. He liked applause more than headlines. "Stand down, Cole," he said, voice even, iron under velvet. Cole's eyes jumped to his employer's face and found no backing. The whip sagged like a bad idea remembered too late. He shoved it through his belt, puffing his chest to pretend it had been nothing. "Just teaching the kid manners." "He's teaching us," someone called from the rail, and laughter, warm this time, stripped of cruelty, rinsed the tension. It irritated Cole more than any insult could have. Ethan hadn't moved. He stood with his palms still lifted, chest heaving, the rope draped slack and harmless. Blaze nosed the boy's shoulder, drawing him back into the private circle the two of them knew how to hold, even in a public pit. Ethan set his forehead to the horses, breath sinking, the old tune catching in his throat and smoothing out. The arc of panic in Blaze's body leveled, like a storm deciding to spend itself over another county. "What would you have me do?" Harrison asked the crowd finally, performing reason the way a man performs a toast. "Keep a creature who will never race? Pay a boy for sentiment? There's work here, not charity." A woman with a baby on her hip lifted her chin. "You've got 1,000 trophies. You can afford one act of grace," a man with sunburned cheeks added. "We teach our kids to keep their promises. Maybe we'd like to see it done." The official crossed his arms, waiting to see which way the field would tilt. Sam didn't look at Harrison. He looked at the horse. "That animal gave this place its name and saw paper more than once. He's earned a pasture and a little respect." Harrison's gaze moved from face to face, calculating, the way a chess player reads a board that has suddenly refused to obey. His jaw worked once. He could shut it all down with a word. He had before, he would again. But the word wouldn't land clean. Not today. The dust itself had a vote. "Very well," he said finally, tone clipped to keep it from sounding like surrender. "The boy has until week's end. The horse will not be sold." He glanced at Cole. Cool, exact. "And there will be no more demonstrations." A faint emphasis. I am still the one who names the terms. Relief rolled through the crowd like wind across wheat. Applause, small, then spreading, fluttered the paper stubs in men's fists. Mary pressed the back of her hand to her mouth to hide the sound that wanted out. Sam nodded once at Ethan, as if to say, "This is how you hold a line." Ethan did not thank Harrison. Gratitude was not the word required by the moment. He bowed his head to Blaze instead, adjusting the bandage with a care that made the rough ring feel like a quiet church. "We're going home," he murmured. The horse breathed against his sleeve, a weight the boy welcomed. They walked out together, not fast, not to prove anything, just steady. People made room where there had been none. A girl reached out and whispered, "He's beautiful," not meaning the horse alone. Someone clapped Ethan on the shoulder. Another pressed a coin into his palm and then, embarrassed by his own kindness, looked away. Tiny reparations, paid to a dignity that had been underfunded too long. At the trailer, Mary caught up, cheeks flushed. "You scared me," she said, voice shaking. "I thought—" She didn't finish. She touched Ethan's elbow instead, a small anchor. "You were brave." Ethan shook his head. "No," he said, and it was the plainest truth he knew. "I was tired of being quiet." Sam swung the ramp into place with a grunt. "Bravery's just the name folks give being tired of the wrong thing," he said. "Get him loaded, son." "Let's get him to clean straw." As they backed Blaze into the trailer, the horse hesitated at the metal lip. Ethan stepped up, placed his foot where Blaze would place his next step, and held the rope like a promise. "With me," he whispered. The horse followed, trusting the small map the boy's body made. The door clanged shut. Dust lifted in the evening wind and settled on everything alike. Money and pride and the printed program with the wrong story on the cover. Harrison stood apart, the set of his shoulders carved from the same stubborn wood as the rails. He turned to leave, but not before his eyes snagged on the boy's profile through the slats. A jaw too thin for stubbornness, and yet there it was, shaping the day. The truck rattled forward, Through the gaps, Ethan watched the fairground recede, the ring like a coin tossed back to the earth, the faces already becoming blur and rumor. He leaned his head against the warm flank beside him and closed his eyes. The vow he had spoken still vibrated in him, a tuning fork struck by fear and forged into something steadier, a line drawn, a door locked, a hand refused to be pried loose. On the road home, the light lowered behind the black oaks. The fields swung past in long green sentences, and the barn on the ridge waited with its tired rafters and its fans that bullied summer air into moving. Ethan felt the tired settle in his bones, honest and heavy. The kind that comes after you pick up the weight that is yours and carry it where it needs to go. By the time they turned into the lane, the boy's breathing had matched the horse's again. In the quiet between them, the day found its proper name. Not miracle, not spectacle, not even victory, not yet. It was this, a refusal, made out loud, to let harm pass for order. A boy had set his small body in front of it. A horse had believed him. And a crowd, surprised by its own decent heart, had remembered how to choose. Back at Harrison Downs, the barn had never felt so full of eyes. Word from the fair spread faster than summer fire through dry grass, and by the time Blaze was led from the trailer, every hand on the ranch seemed to find a reason to linger. Men leaned against posts with folded arms. Women paused at the kitchen doorway. Even the younger stable boys crept to the fences. All of them wanted to see the horse that had walked when it shouldn't, and the boy who had made it happen. Blaze stepped off the ramp slowly, his gait uneven but stronger than when he had been loaded hours before. Ethan walked beside him, hand light on the rope, his shoulders squared against the weight of so many stairs. The humiliation of weeks past still burned in him, but tonight it was layered with something harder to bend. Proof. Not proof that Blaze was whole again, but proof that despair was not the final word. Cole shoved through the crowd, his jaw set, whip nowhere in sight but his sneer sharp as ever. "A circus trick," he spat. "He'll collapse in the stall by morning." His words drew chuckles from a few of the ranch hands, but they rang hollow, like coins struck from bad metal. Sam's voice came from the shadows near the forge. "Funny kind of trick that makes a horse lift his head again." The old farrier didn't raise his tone, but every ear caught it, and silence followed. Inside the stall, Ethan unwrapped the soiled bandage, replaced it with fresh cloth smeared with poultice from his grandmother's notes. His fingers were blistered, his arms sore, but he worked with care, as though the whole world's dignity lived inside that wound. Blaze flinched, but didn't resist. When Ethan finished, he sat back against the boards, too tired to rise, and whispered, "We showed them, boy." Not enough yet, but a start. Blaze lowered his head until it rested briefly against Ethan's shoulder, and the boy felt his chest loosen in a way it hadn't for months. That night, in the dim glow of lanterns, Blaze shifted onto his uninjured legs and pushed himself upright. The sound of hooves against the stall floor drew gasps from the men who lingered outside. He wavered, but held his stance, nostrils flaring, eyes alert. Ethan scrambled to his feet, hands out but not pulling, letting the horse steady himself. The sight sent a ripple through the barn, the broken champion standing by his own strength. Cole cursed under his breath and stomped away, muttering about wasted time. Mary appeared quietly at Ethan's side, pressing a piece of bread into his hand. For you, she said, her voice hushed. You look like you haven't eaten in days. Ethan wanted to thank her, but the lump in his throat made words useless. He only nodded and took a small bite, his eyes never leaving Blaze. Over the next days, Ethan pushed through punishing chores by daylight and returned to Blaze each evening. He rubbed liniment into tired muscles, applied herbs, and hummed songs that belonged to nights by a Tennessee fire, long extinguished. The horse grew steadier. The swelling eased under the boy's relentless tending, and when Blaze took 3 steps in a row without stumbling, Ethan laughed out loud for the first time anyone on the ranch could remember. The laughter carried down the aisle, drawing looks. Some smiled despite themselves, others frowned at the disruption of what they thought they knew. Sam leaned on his hammer, his beard hiding the hint of a grin. Steps, he muttered. That's how mountains get climbed. Not everyone approved. Harrison himself watched from the loft balcony, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the horse obeying not rope or spur, but the murmur of a boy no one valued. Pride and irritation warred across his face. For a man who measured worth in trophies and speed, the idea that patience and respect might hold power was an insult he couldn't swallow. Still, the evidence spread. Workers who had bet against Ethan now lingered longer at the stall, pretending to sweep or mend, while their eyes tracked each new sign of strength. Blaze's coat brightened, his steps grew steadier, and each evening his gaze sought Ethan before anyone else. It was not a racehorse's return, not yet, but it was undeniable life returned where everyone had sworn it gone. One evening, as the sun bled orange over the hills, Ethan led Blaze out into the paddock. The air smelled of clover and warm dust. He let the rope hang loose, walking slow circles while Blaze followed with ears pricked. The horse stumbled once, but corrected himself, standing taller afterward. Ethan brushed his hand along the mane and whispered, "You're showing them, one step at a time." Behind the fence, ranch hands whispered to each other, their usual jeers replaced by something closer to awe. Even Mary's laughter, soft and uncertain, floated above the grass. Sam tapped ash from his pipe, watching quietly, knowing this was more than a boy and a horse. It was a battle fought with patience instead of force, and patience was winning. By the time the stars pricked the sky, Blaze stood steady in the pasture, his head high, the moonlight silvering his white coat. Ethan leaned against the fence, weary to the bone, but filled with a light that outshone his exhaustion. He had no illusions. The challenge wasn't over. Harrison wasn't swayed, and Cole's anger simmered like a hidden coal. But the horse had walked, then stood, and now even the doubters could not ignore it. It was not triumph in the way races were won, but something slower, deeper. A victory of steps. And each one carried them closer to a truth that could not be mocked away, that broken things were not always finished, and that even the smallest hands could lift a spirit from the dust. In the days that followed the fair, Harrison Downs no longer felt quite the same. It wasn't that the routines had changed. Horses were still fed at dawn, stalls mucked out, leather oiled until it gleamed. But there was a new weight in the air, a hum of curiosity that traveled from one worker to the next. The boy who had once been no more than a broom in the corner was suddenly the center of every whispered conversation. Ethan tried to keep his head down, but the stares followed him. Skeptical, mocking, or strangely respectful. The ripple had begun. Blaze himself carried the proof. Each morning, Ethan returned to the stall. The white horse would shift and lift his head, eyes brightening when the boy entered. No longer the glassy gaze of an animal resigned to pain, but something alert, alive. When Ethan worked the poultices into the swollen leg, Blaze tolerated the sting with a patience none of the ranch hands had ever seen. Sometimes he even leaned into the boy's hand, as though finding comfort where once he'd only braced for cruelty. Sam noticed first. Standing at the forge, he paused in his hammering to watch. "There's change in that horse," he muttered, voice nearly lost in the clang. Later, he ambled over, chewing the stem of his pipe. "Keep steady, boy. Don't let the laughter sway you. Animals know truth better than men, and that horse is telling it plain." His words sank deep, a kind of anchor against the storm Ethan lived in each day. Not everyone took it kindly. Cole prowled the aisles like a wolf robbed of prey. He doubled Ethan's chores, loaded his arms with hay bales twice his size, and barked orders designed to break him. Yet every evening, when the barn grew quiet, Ethan returned to Blaze with herbs tucked in his shirt and songs on his lips. Mary slipped him jars of honey and warm cloths, her eyes shining with a loyalty she never voiced in front of others. Slowly, even the cooks and stable boys began to offer small kindnesses, an extra heel of bread, a bucket of water left where Ethan would find it. Little rebellions against the foreman's cruelty, sparked by the sight of a boy and a broken horse refusing to give in. One afternoon, as the sun flared white over the paddock, Ethan dared something bold. He led Blaze from the stall into the open air. The horse limped, ears flicking nervously at the sudden space, but he did not collapse. Step by halting step, they moved across the grass. Sweat ran down Ethan's spine as he walked beside him, murmuring encouragement with every breath. Workers dropped their tools, watching from the fences. Some smirked, waiting for failure, but when Blaze reached the water trough and lowered his head to drink without stumbling, even the smirks faltered. Mary clapped her hands together once, quickly, as though afraid the sound would break the moment. Sam grinned behind his beard. "Steps again," he said softly. "That's how change travels. One, then another, and soon the ground looks different." Harrison watched from the porch of the big house, a glass of bourbon in his hand. His eyes were hard, narrowed against the sight that unsettled him. He could not deny the progress, yet he despised the implication that a penniless boy had achieved what his doctors could not. Pride warred with calculation, and in that war Harrison found no comfort. By evening, the ranch hummed with talk. Some still dismissed it as luck, others as a fluke, soon to fail. But a few began to wonder aloud whether the broom boy's methods carried truth. Around the cookhouse fire, hands argued in low tones. "Did you see how he followed the kid? Never thought a horse would trust someone like that." "Respect," Sam said simply, and the word settled like a stone in water, rippling outward. Ethan heard none of it. He sat in the straw beside Blaze, notebook open on his knees, tracing his grandmother's words by lantern light. "Respect heals faster than force." He repeated the phrase aloud, as though teaching himself as much as the horse. Blaze shifted, lowering his great head until his muzzle brushed the boy's shoulder. The touch carried no grandeur, no triumph, only trust. But in that barn filled with silence and shadows, it felt larger than any trophy. The ripple was real now. It spread in whispers, in small acts of defiance, in the way men watched more carefully and mocked less loudly. It had not yet reached the heart of Mr. Harrison, nor extinguished the fire in Cole's eyes. But it was moving, unstoppable. Ethan felt it in every breath, every step Blaze took beside him. They had not won. Not yet. But the ranch had begun to shift, and with each passing day, it was less the master's world alone and more the shared ground of a boy, a horse, and the truth they refused to let die. The fairground ordeal might have ended, but at Harrison Downs the tension thickened like a storm waiting for its cue. Ethan could feel it in the way footsteps paused when he passed, in the way conversations hushed when he entered the barn. The ripple effect had stirred, something dangerous, curiosity among the workers, irritation in Cole, and pride bruised to rawness in Mr. Harrison himself. The boy had turned an embarrassment into a spectacle that people admired, and Harrison could not abide admiration he did not command. One afternoon, with the sky hanging low and the fields hot enough to shimmer, Harrison called everyone to the main yard. He stood at the center, a pale figure in his spotless shirt, his cane tapping once against the packed earth. "Enough of these games," he said, his voice cool and measured, though his jaw was tight. "If this boy and his crippled horse wish to prove themselves, let them do it in front of us all. No whispers, no tricks." The men shifted uneasily. Mary stood near the kitchen porch, her hands clenched against her apron, while Sam leaned on the fence with his pipe, smoke curling around his head. Cole grinned like a man who had been starving and suddenly smelled meat. Harrison's gaze fell on Ethan. "At week's end, you will bring Blaze to the track." He must trot a full lap without faltering, not limping, not crawling, trotting. The word hung sharp in the air. "If he manages, you stay. If not, you're gone, and the horse with you." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A trot was no simple walk. It demanded rhythm, strength, balance. Blaze had only just managed steps without collapsing. The wager was cruelly stacked, but Harrison spoke it as though it were law carved into stone. Ethan's heart pounded, but he lifted his chin. "We'll do it," he said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. Blaze, standing in the paddock nearby, flicked his ears as though he'd heard and accepted the vow. That night, the barn pulsed with a tension that felt alive. Workers whispered about odds, Cole spread doubt like seed, and even the cookhouse hummed with speculation. Ethan ignored them all. He slipped into Blaze's stall, pressed his forehead to the horses, and whispered, "We have 4 days, boy. 4 days to do what none of them believe." The training began before dawn. Ethan led Blaze slowly across the paddock, guiding him in small circles, coaxing rhythm into each step. Blaze faltered often, his injured leg quivering, sweat dripping from his hide. Ethan never pulled, never forced. He hummed tunes, spoke encouragement, let the horse set the pace. When Blaze stumbled, Ethan crouched beside him, waiting until trust pulled them forward again. Cole watched from the fence, jeering. "All you're teaching him is to fall slower." His laughter carried across the fields, but Ethan ignored it. Mary brought water jars at midday, her eyes darting nervously toward the big house. "They'll make it harder on you," she whispered. But Ethan only nodded, too focused to waste words. Sam sharpened shoes at the forge, his hammer ringing steady, and muttered, "Respect teaches legs quicker than rope." "Keep at it, lad." Each evening Blaze managed a few more steps, his stride shaky but growing steadier. Ethan's arms ached, his back screamed, but hope fed him where food could not. He studied the notebook by lantern light, memorizing every line his grandmother had left. Patience before progress, trust before speed. He traced the words with his finger until they etched themselves into his bones. On the eve of the challenge, Ethan led Blaze onto the track for the first time. The sun bled red across the horizon, painting horse and boy in the glow of fire. The oval stretched before them, daunting, endless. Blaze trembled, nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar ground. Ethan stroked his neck, whispering, "It's just dirt, same as the barn floor." One step, then another. Together they walked, then coaxed into a hesitant trot. Blaze stumbled halfway, nearly falling, but caught himself. Ethan's heart soared. "That's it, boy." That's the beginning. From the shadows of the grandstand, Harrison watched, his eyes cold and calculating. Cole stood beside him, muttering promises of failure, but neither could deny the sight before them. A horse once discarded, trotting beneath the faith of a boy no one had valued. When the sun dipped fully, Ethan and Blaze stood in the center of the track, both trembling, both exhausted. Ethan leaned his head against Blaze's warm neck, whispering, "Tomorrow, they'll try to see you fall. But you won't be alone. We'll face them together." The horse breathed out heavily, his muzzle brushing the boy's shoulder, a gesture of trust sealed in silence. As darkness folded over Harrison Downs, anticipation thickened. The workers whispered of wagers, Cole sharpened his cruelty, Harrison polished his pride. But in the quiet stall where boy and horse rested side by side, something stronger than fear stirred. A promise not of victory alone, but of dignity reclaimed. The last challenge loomed, sharp as a blade, and the ranch braced for the cut. The morning of the trial arrived with a sky as pale as bleached linen, the air thick with expectation. Harrison Downs had not been so crowded in years. Wagons lined the fences, men in hats leaned against rails, women fanned themselves in the heat, and children clambered up posts for a better view. Word had spread beyond the county. The boy who dared to challenge his master was about to be judged. Every eye was fixed on the track where Ethan stood with Blaze at his side, a rope draped loosely between them. Harrison emerged from the grandstand dressed in white, his presence commanding silence. He raised a hand, as though blessing a congregation. "Today," he declared, "we settle this farce. If the horse trots one full lap, the boy may remain. If he falters," his voice sharpened like a blade, "he leaves, and the horse leaves with him." Murmurs surged through the crowd, wagers whispered, odds tallied, hearts braced for spectacle. Ethan pressed his forehead to Blaze's, shutting out the noise. "It's just us, boy. We've done steps. Now we do more." One breath, one stride, together Blaze's ears flicked, his warm breath brushing against the boy's cheek. For a moment, the world shrank to the bond they had forged in silence, stronger than the jeers or the threats. The official dropped a flag. The crowd roared. Ethan stepped forward, humming the tune his grandmother had left him, low and steady. Blaze hesitated, muscles quivering, then lifted his head and moved into a halting trot. The dust rose around them like smoke. Gasps rippled as the horse managed the first few strides, uneven but defiant. Half a lap in, sweat streaked Ethan's face. Blaze stumbled, his leg giving way, and a cruel cheer burst from Cole near the fence. "Down he goes!" But Ethan rushed to Blaze's side, steadying him with both arms. "Don't listen," he whispered fiercely. "You're more than they see." "We'll keep going." The horse blew out a shuddering breath and found his balance again, ears tipped toward the boy's voice. The track stretched endless. With every stride, the crowd shifted, doubt eroding into awe. The workers who had once mocked now fell silent, their faces marked by something unfamiliar. Respect. Mary clasped her hands, lips moving in a prayer. Sam stood straight, eyes gleaming behind his beard, pipe forgotten. Even the children no longer laughed, but cheered with small voices that cut the tension like bells. Near the final stretch, Cole moved along the rail, whip in hand, hatred gleaming. Harrison's pride teetered between fury and fear. Cole's arm twitched, ready to sabotage. But before he could strike, a hand seized his wrist. Sam's grip, iron from years at the forge, held him fast. "Enough!" the old farrier growled. "Let the boy have his chance." Cole's snarl died under the weight of every gaze turning against him. He dropped the whip, retreating into the shadows of his own disgrace. Ethan never saw the exchange. He walked with Blaze, step by halting step, his voice steady despite the fire in his lungs. The final curve loomed. Blaze faltered, nearly crumpling, but Ethan pressed his head against the horse's cheek, whispering, "Not for them. For us. For who we are." The horse lifted, gathering strength not from muscle, but from trust. He pushed into the last stretch, stride uneven but sure. When they crossed the line, the crowd erupted. Some cheered, some wept, others stood stunned into silence. The impossible had unfolded before their eyes, a broken horse trotting under the care of a boy who had been invisible. Ethan clung to Blaze's neck, tears cutting tracks through dust on his face. Harrison stepped forward, his pride cracked like dry earth. For a long moment he said nothing. Jaw clenched, cane digging into the ground. Finally, through teeth tight with venom, he spoke. "The boy stays. The horse stays. This ranch will remember." His voice lacked the triumph he once wielded. The power had shifted. Everyone felt it. Mary rushed to Ethan's side, pressing a trembling hand to his shoulder. "You did it," she whispered, though her eyes told him she had known he would all along. Sam nodded from the fence, his gaze steady, the faintest smile beneath his beard. "Respect," he murmured. "That's what won the day." As the crowd dispersed, Ethan led Blaze back toward the barn. No ropes pulled, no whips threatened, only a boy walking beside a horse, their steps in rhythm, the dust rising to mark their passage. For the first time, Ethan did not feel small. He felt seen. Blaze's head brushed his shoulder, a gesture of kinship. Together they moved through the fading light, not as master and beast, but as companions who had restored each other's dignity. That evening, when the barn settled into quiet and the hills burned with sunset, Ethan sat in the straw with Blaze lying close. He opened his grandmother's notebook and traced the words underlined in red. "Respect heals faster than force." He whispered them aloud, voice steady now. "We proved it, didn't we?" Blaze shifted, breathing deep and calm, and Ethan smiled through the ache of exhaustion. The ranch would never be the same. Harrison's pride had been bent, Cole's cruelty exposed, and the men who once mocked now spoke in hushed tones of what they had witnessed. The ripple had grown into a tide. And at the heart of it, a boy who had once been invisible, and a horse left for dead had walked into the dust and returned with dignity no one could deny. They had not only survived the challenge, they had changed the story of Harrison Downs forever. And now, tell me, if you were standing in Ethan's place, would you have done the same? Drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments to let me know what's in your heart. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next powerful story of love, courage, and the unbreakable bond between people and animals. More journeys like this are waiting for you.